begin in about 5 minutes. So just so you know, 5 minutes. Please enjoy some refreshments.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you. So I'm Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola. It's a real privilege to do so. And I want to thank you. This is our sixth installment in Envisioning a Livable Future, our year-long collaboration with our sister Jesuit school in Cleveland, John Carroll University. In the spirit of Pope Francis's Laudato Si, this series aims to create a lively interdisciplinary dialogues raising ecological consciousness and drawing attention to climate-forward initiatives and encouraging both personal discernment, as the Jesuits walk in, the word discernment gets said, and social action. And I'm so glad, I haven't seen them, but I hope they're here. Hey. I'm so glad our colleagues and friends, Dr. Bernard Prusak, Sister Catherine Feely from John Carroll, are here in person tonight. Kind greetings, Bernard and Catherine. And Bernard hatched this idea for the series, and we've collaborated on 6 things. And it's been a delight to work with you both and have dinner last night, so good to see you. You will notice by the title of tonight's installment in our Laudato Si series that it's concerned, like Pope Francis was, with another kind of ecology. That of digital culture, creeping AI, and what Pope Francis critiques as the technocratic paradigm in his 2015 encyclical. And in chapter 3 of that kind of game-changing encyclical, that document, and I direct you to section 107, Pope Francis writes a most decisive insight. And I'm required to quote this at length because of the gravity and acuity of his wisdom. And so I quote our dearly departed friend and Holy Father, Pope Francis. He writes this: "It can be said that many problems of today's world stem from the tendency, at times unconscious, to make the method and aims of science and technology an epistemological paradigm which shapes the lives of individuals and the workings of society. The effects of imposing this model on reality as a whole, human and social, are seen in the deterioration of the environment. But this is just one sign of a reductionism which affects every aspect of human and social life. We have to accept that technological products are not neutral, for they create a framework which ends up conditioning lifestyles and shaping social possibilities along the lines dictated by the interests of certain powerful groups." For our speakers tonight, the great Eugene McCarraher from Villanova, great Tony Mills from Notre Dame, this text is serving as the common point of departure. We talked about this text, and you're going to hear some reference to it. Gene will begin the proceedings and speak for about 15 minutes. Tony will follow and speak for about 15 minutes. Then the 3 of us will bat it around for a few minutes before we turn it to you, dear audience, for your views on the matter. We also invite our live stream friends to do the live chat. There's well over 500, I think we're into 600 now, people watching live, and hello, live stream people. And we have so many questions in advance, and I'm going to put those into play as well. Of course, they come to us through the wonders of tech. But we're in for a treat, and both Gene and Tony are superb, thoughtful, their bios as you are able. Before we begin, 2 more small items, both under the banner and heading of gratitude. First, thanks to our crackerjack, intrepid, always good-natured Hank Center staff, our center manager, Katie Arnold, our graduate assistant, Julian Sieber, and our all-star undergrad team, Emily, Vincent, and Matthew. Great work as always, team. Word of gratitude is to God for the gift and life of Sister Jean Dolores Schmidt, a sister of charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And like many, so many, I was happy to call her friend, but in truth, it feels like I've lost a cherished aunt. Sister Jean was dear to me and a great friend of the Hank Center as well, and so we ask and pray that you rest in peace, Sister Jean, and may your goodness, grace, and quick wit entertain the angels. From one Jean to another, Sister Jean would chide me already for going on too long.
I want to thank Mike and the Hank Center for inviting me. And second, if any of you take umbrage at anything I say tonight, blame the chatbot. I have a lot of things going on in my life, so I have to, farm it out. So there you go. So one of the most persistent misunderstandings of Pope Francis' Laudato Si, even after a decade, has been that it was a statement about the ecological crisis. In other words, global warming, the reduction in biodiversity, the depletion of water and other important resources, the metastasis of waste from our capitalist forms of production and consumption. Yet while it's understandable that Laudato Si has been read that way, the subtitle is, after all, Care for Our Common Home. There's also insight and wisdom about technology, and specifically the technocratic paradigm, that I would argue is the encyclical's most incisive and most enduring contribution to Catholic social thought. So my remarks about the promise and peril of AI will be, I hope, in the spirit of that contribution. Perhaps because I'm what I sometimes call a hopeful pessimist, I'll be concentrating on the perils. The technocratic paradigm, as Pope Francis calls it, is a view of nature, and even more insidiously of human beings, as mere raw material for mastery and manipulation. Now, modern societies have adopted what he calls an undifferentiated and one-dimensional paradigm, whose center is, quote, a subject who, using logical and rational procedures, progressively approaches and gains control over an external object. It is, quote, a technique of possession, mastery, and transformation in which the object is considered, quote, formless, completely open to manipulation, and the subject aims to, quote, extract everything possible from it. Under the technocratic paradigm, there is no theoretical limit on the ability to possess and transform the world through technology. The technocratic paradigm is therefore similar to the instrumental reason described by Max Weber and then by the Frankfurt School Marxists, especially Max Horkheimer. I don't know if Francis' characterization of the paradigm as one-dimensional is a reference to Herbert Marcuse, though I'd be delighted if it was. But I think it's a point that can't be made often enough. If nature and people are simply stuff to be mastered, used, or improved, then all defective versions of nature or people can be eliminated. Hence the exploitation of resources, as if the world is just a storehouse of power, and also of workers. In other words, people stripped down to their ability to labor. And these workers are also known as human resources. In its current forms, AI reflects and enlarges, I think, this technocratic paradigm. It's designed by technocrats and celebrated by their minions among the business and political intelligentsia, all of whom conceive the human mind and the human person fundamentally as a machine. It rests on a model of the mind as a computational device, and on a model of the person as a repository of resources to be optimized with utmost efficiency and minimal cost. And yet, although we usually think of the technocratic paradigm as thoroughly secular and rationalized, it can possess an enchanted quality, an enchantment that's all the more beguiling and therefore dangerous precisely because of its worldly veneer. It finds a concrete expression in the fetishism of automation, epitomized in the hysteria over AI, that complements the kind of pecuniary enchantment whose metaphysics and morality I examined in a book called The Enchantments of Mammon. Now, despite this secular and disenchanted visage, capitalism, I think, has always harbored a utopian desire, an end of history, a beatific vision, a heavenly city of business that, in the minds of our technocratic shamans, might even expand one day to encompass all the other planets in the solar system. Capitalism, in other words, was always more than simply Marx's rage to accumulate. It unleashed a rage to divinize, a fury to possess and exercise the knowledge, power, and status of the gods. So I think we should think of the technicians and the financiers as the magi and sorcerers of our age of technological enchantment. Technology and its creators have, of course, always been linked with magic and divination. And some of the most incisive contemporary observers of AI recognize the fetishism that mystifies artificial intelligence. I just note here that Silicon Valley's techno-futurism, whether it's euphoric or apocalyptic, has always been heavily inflected with religiosity. Now, note the quotation marks that I've used about artificial intelligence. I believe that much of the way we think about this phenomenon is wrong-headed. First, artificial intelligence is not intelligence. I'm with David Bentley Hart on this. Machines don't think. They don't have emergent properties, as Google CEO Sundar Pichai likes to gas off now and then. To be sure, computers can produce so compelling a simulacrum of mental activity that we fall under their spell. We anthropomorphize them as well as enchant them. Computers and algorithms are such wonderful creations of our own minds that they can appear to be autonomous, rational agents in and of themselves, fetishes, in other words. But this is, I think, to completely and fatefully misunderstand both our minds and computers. Because our minds are so much more than mere computational devices, and the history of how we came to think of our minds as computers is worth talking about. There can be no thought in a computer, no subjectivity or intentionality. The coding syntax doesn't exist in the computer. As Hart says, this is like mistaking the ink and paper of a book for its content. Hypnotized by the fabrications of our own ingenuity, we forget that a computer consists of components that produce mechanical processes that contain notations representing meaning. So one of AI's chief perils, I'd suggest, is not that it is or could be conscious, but that it never could be. The real danger is that we will think machines think, and that our enthrallment to the latest in a long line of sophisticated technological fetishes will reduce us to unthinking components in the machinations designed by Silicon Valley and Wall Street, who are the chief contemporary avatars of the technocratic paradigm, whose vision of our future has nothing to do with our flourishing and everything to do with their own sense of technological and mercenary virtuosity. AI is a machine, of course, and so I think we should talk about it as part of the history of machinery, and more specifically of automation. If AI is the automation or mechanization of human cognitive labor, then its promise and peril, while obviously in some ways unique, is also akin to the promise and peril of other automated industrial technologies since the 18th century. Now, material abundance and relief from tedious or dangerous labor have been the promises of automation since the dawn of the industrial era. From Smith, Marx, and Keynes to much lesser lights like Ezra Klein. Automation, we were assured, would emancipate us from privation and toil. And certainly, the productivity of industrial technology has been spectacular. And we now produce more goods with an ever-diminishing modicum of labor. But what our focus on the productivity of technology has led us to forget, I think, is that whatever justice or equity we've achieved in the distribution of its fruits has been the result of social and political struggle, not simply a straightforward gift of mechanical plenty. I don't doubt that AI can and will deliver us from boring, unnecessary mental labor. Many of my friends who are scientists tell me that it has aided them immensely in their research. But whatever good has come with technological advance, I think we need to remember, has been a political as well as a technological achievement. So, the perils. As Francis describes with such sorrow and anger in Laudato Si, our technologies have caused extensive and, to some extent, irreparable ecological despoliation. And one of the very real dangers of AI, one that I don't think gets enough attention, is its ecological impact. In its current forms, AI promises to be an ecological catastrophe, with its data centers dependent on enormous amounts of electricity and water, its training models that exude massive carbon emissions, and the production of its hardware that requires ever higher levels of resource extraction and produces vast amounts of electronic waste. And AI's most celebrated figures openly admit this in their way. Sam Altman of OpenAI, for example, recently asserted that, quote, a significant fraction of the power on Earth should be spent running AI compute, end quote. Well, at least he's honest. I like that kind of candor. I'd also add that we're deluded in thinking that AI represents some unprecedentedly ethereal form of technology. Note terms like the cloud. A delusion shattered once we realize how many millions around the world toil to mine the minerals, harness the data, and curate the images utilized by, for example, Amazon's Mechanical Turk. The cloud, in other words, requires an enormous and unseen amount of very terrestrial exploitation. As with other forms of automation, technological unemployment is usually one popular fear about AI. Now here, as with other forms of automation, it's not massive unemployment so much as the degradation of labor that concerns me about AI. Historians of labor have written incisively and sometimes eloquently about the destruction of artisanal skills in the wake of industrialization. And they've done so not out of some kind of misplaced nostalgia, but out of a concern that the de-skilling of human beings, the extraction and subsequent relocation of their skills in technologies that they do not design, was one of the primary injustices and indignities of industrial capitalism. I have the same fear about AI. While gaining access to enormous amounts of information in little time can be a positive development, the mechanization of other cognitive skills doesn't bode well, I think. I fear that we're making ourselves stupid by offloading so much of our cognitive labor to AI. At the same time, we've made ourselves far too open to the algorithmization and surveillance of our desires, our curiosity, our very personalities. Now, personality, of course, has been a product since the inception of capitalism. In other words, both our own personalities and the personalities created for products and corporations by advertisers and public relations professionals. So the emergence of an influencer culture along AI is really, I think, just the neoliberal phase of the capitalist moral imagination. What's different is the scale of this personality market. So many people are participating, and even religion is now marketed in this way. And the manner in which personality is now defined and shaped in the digital panopticon of algorithmic supervision. Philip Murawski, an economist at Notre Dame, has written about what he calls the entrepreneurial self. The self as defined by clicks, likes, product recommendations, etc. Influencer culture is, I think, a perfect emblem of the technocratic paradigm because it reduces the self to what can be marketed, sold, transformed in accordance with the dictates of the marketplace. Another popular anxiety about AI, shared by some of AI's own proponents, is that it may eventuate in our subjugation or even destruction by some machinic supermind or superintelligence. Now, the nightmare of robotic or technological tyranny is at least as old as Samuel Butler's Erewhon, Karl Čapek's RUR, and E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. But I think that popular fears of control and surveillance by machinery are misdirected, since they partake, I think, of a reification of technology as some sort of force in and of itself. What we forget when we complain about technology out of control is that tools and machines are created by people. They're out to get me. Tools and machines are created by people, and that therefore they embody certain interests and values. And this is, of course, what the quote from Pope Francis that Mike read earlier. Francis himself reminds us that, quote, technological products are not neutral, and, quote, decisions which may seem purely instrumental are in reality decisions about the kind of society we want to build, all of which applies to AI. Automation, I think, has been a domination fantasy of the techno-intelligentsia. In other words, complete control of the workplace and of that exasperating proletariat. Abolition of our human estate of weakness, frailty, and impermanence. Delusions of future mastery, rather than pleasure in the fleeting delights of the present. So I think that any putative enslavement to automated superminds would in fact be servitude to the engineers, technicians, and capitalists who design and bankroll their development. As always, our overlords have human faces, even when they issue their commands in the numeric ventriloquism of code. That's my main concern about AI. Not the technology per se, but rather the inhuman worldview of the people who make and beatify it, and by a pervasive sense that there's nothing to be done to stop it or assert popular control over it. I'm more concerned by the transhumanism, or rather the inhumanism, that in my view serves as a kind of eschatology of the technocrats, the technological consummation of a perverse attempt at theosis or divinization. I'm more concerned by popular acquiescence to AI, our uncritical parroting of the rhetoric of inevitability, our willingness to surrender our personal and political agency to a ruling class intent on turning our collective future into a technocratic vanity project. What is to be done, to quote Lenin? I could provide an agenda, all of which would amount to a fundamentally democratic socialist program in which workers would design and use the technologies of their daily labors. I still think that Rosa Luxemburg was right. Perhaps now more than ever, it's socialism or barbarism. But most socialists have, in their own way, embraced the technocratic paradigm. And that needs to be surpassed, I'd suggest, by a sacramental sensibility and imagination, one that sees nature and our fellow men and women as, in Hopkins' words, charged with the grandeur of God. In short, a cosmological as well as a political and technological revolution. Utopian? Yes. Romantic? Absolutely and unashamedly. But that's why I'm a hopeful pessimist. As James Baldwin would remind us, history testifies to nothing less than the perpetual achievement of the impossible. And as believers in a man who rose from the dead should affirm, stranger things have happened. Thank you.
Talk back, and if you have something you want to confirm or agree with or push back on, we're waiting for that for the Q&A part. Let's welcome Tony to the podium. Tony Mills.
Well, I just want to start by saying thank you to Mike and to the Hank Center, to Loyola for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to share the stage, so to speak. So I had a brief introduction prepared, and then I saw when Gene shared with me his remarks before coming over here that we had prepared very similar brief introductions. So I'm going to say a little bit and then sort of skip to the substance. So what I thought I would do is say something about the technocratic. Laudato Si, and I think this is the technocratic paradigm and the critique that he offers, the enduring significance of that. And then try to articulate what I take to be the critique that the encyclical lodges against the technocratic paradigm and the alternative vision or paradigm that it points us towards. And then in conclusion, I'm going to say a bit about the relevance of all this for artificial intelligence. So I share the contention that Laudato Si is sort of wrongly paradigm rooted in what Pope Francis called integral ecology, which I see as an extension and development of ideas that his predecessors had themselves developed in the context of the Catholic intellectual tradition and Catholic social teaching. I think there's a lot that this critique and this tradition can offer us today. So what is the technocratic paradigm? We heard from Gene about this. I'm going to give my own sort of characterization, which runs in some parallels, I think. So I see this as fundamentally rooted in three kinds of claims. I won't reread the quote, but roughly the technocratic paradigm is a generalization or a universalization of the scientific method to encompass everything. So not just nature, but also social, political, and moral life. But I think it rests on three philosophical claims. The encyclical doesn't quite unpack them this way, but I think this is discernible there. The first is just a straightforward kind of scientism, which sees the deliverances of modern natural science as the only source of knowledge or truth. This is a familiar kind of idea. I think there's a second component, though, which is related but distinguishable, which is a view of science as a technique, as reducible to technique, a kind of method that treats nature as raw material to be manipulated, but that this neutral technique can be generalized, as I said before, to encompass not only the natural world, but also the realm of human relations, the realm of politics. So this is a claim not only about sources of knowledge, but also the nature of scientific knowledge itself. And this is also closely connected to a third claim, a third philosophical claim implied in the technocratic paradigm. And this is the view that history has a kind of teleological structure, that it is progressive, and that social and moral progress take place through the application of this scientific method or technique to ever more domains of life. Taken together, we have a paradigm for understanding just about everything. What is an alternative to this paradigm? So I think what's interesting about Laudato Si is that it's sometimes thought of, and was when it first appeared, as a anti-science, anti-technological, even anti-modern document. And there certainly are passages that would maybe support something like that interpretation. But I think that fundamentally this interpretation of the encyclical goes astray. And what I want to suggest is that Laudato Si points us to an alternative vision, one that has its sources in classical antiquity and the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that's rooted in an anthropology. So I think it's quite important here that the technocratic paradigm is not merely problematic for its moral and political consequences, which Gene was describing earlier. Pope Francis is quite clear in Laudato Si that ultimately a moral account of ecology has to be rooted in a proper anthropology. That ecology has to be rooted in some true conception of the human person. And I think we can see the ways in which the technocratic paradigm obscures, thins out, and ultimately falsifies the conception of the human person. And so I want to suggest three dimensions that we should look to, which this encyclical directs us towards, dimensions of the human person. One is the capacity to know. We can think of this as the capacity to engage in science. But here, knowledge is understood in something more like its classical form. A virtue, an intellectual virtue, a capacity to uncover the intelligibility in nature, an intelligibility that transcends the human person. It's not something that is the artifice of the human person, is not mere raw material that we mold, but is something beyond that we can somehow glimpse through our intellectual capacities. The second dimension is our capacity to create and produce. If the first dimension I mentioned can be thought of as science, we can think of the second one as a kind of technological capability, what the Greeks called techne, the ability to have a rational expertise and to use that to create, to build, to shape our natural environment in ways that are conducive to human flourishing. And this is also, at least according to Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition, a virtue, an intellectual virtue like the capacity to know. The third is our capacity to engage in moral reasoning, to judge, to engage in judgment and deliberation about our ends and the appropriate means of achieving those ends. This too is a virtue, a preeminent practical virtue, according to Aristotle at least. And it's something that I think is ultimately the horizon in which we should think about the encyclical's critique of the technocratic paradigm, which is also very suggestive for thinking about AI, so I want to come back to that. So, how does the technocratic paradigm falsify this picture of the human person? I think we can see it by collapsing these three dimensions into one kind of undifferentiated conception of rationality. Gene mentioned the concept of instrumental reason. I think this is very apt here. If we think about our capacity to know, a capacity to engage in scientific reasoning, our capacity to produce and to create, and our capacity to engage in moral reasoning, these are distinctive capacities. They have, each has its own integrity, its own virtue. The technocratic paradigm reduces all of these to one, and that is the capacity to achieve pre-given ends in the most efficient manner possible. With the implication, as I said, that its material is mere raw material to be shaped. The danger here is that our ends, the purposes to which these capacities may be put, become subordinated or relativized to mere subjective preferences, things about which we cannot reason. And thereby, instrumental reason itself becomes its own kind of end. And we wind up with a picture in which the efficient achievement of ends is an end in and of itself. Okay. So what would it mean to counter this? And let me here turn specifically to the contemporary scene. Laudato Si was articulated in the context of ecological crisis, but I think many of its insights are directly pertinent to the contemporary world and a lot of the digital technologies that we were hearing about earlier. One of the things that I think is quite distinctive about current forms of artificial intelligence, and here I think I may differ slightly with Gene, is that it's not mere computation. What we see with the advent of generative artificial intelligence, so-called, is an ability to automate or to simulate a whole range of human capacities, which were previously thought to be not subject to that kind of automation. We are, in the 21st century, accustomed to the idea that certain kinds of manual labor can be automated to some degree, that certain kinds of cognitive tasks can be automated. We take for granted that run-of-the-mill calculators are quite sophisticated forms of automation of certain kinds of human cognitive abilities. What I think is striking about the current generation of AI is really twofold. One, that its capability derives from its having been in a certain way socialized in the world, the artificial world that we've created through the internet. There's an interesting kind of sidebar here in the history of artificial intelligence, where one of the debates that took place in the kind of first wave of AI was whether AI needed to be embodied in order to engage in certain kinds of cognitive tasks. And the opposing view to this was that AI didn't have to be embodied, but it had to be socialized. What generative AI has effectively done, because of the data made available through the internet, is allowed for some kind of socialization of a certain kind, with very surprising results. And so this gets to the second unique aspect of AI, in my view, which is that realms of human experience that were previously insulated from technological automation are now potentially vulnerable to it. And I think you could look at the three dimensions of the human person that I identified and see that each of them in a certain way appears to be, you could say, vulnerable to AI. The capacity to know, there's much discussion nowadays about the role of AI in scientific discovery. I think there's an interesting question about how realistic some of those claims are. Maybe we can talk about that later. But we can certainly see a diffusion of AI capabilities into the domain of scientific research, which is maybe not without precedent, but certainly quite striking. Obviously, secondly, we can see that modern forms of AI enable us to achieve certain ends very efficiently. And in this sense, it's a fairly conventional kind of modern technological capability. And this, I think, is closely connected to the second dimension of the human person I mentioned, the capacity to create or produce. And the third is the capacity to engage in reasoning, even moral reasoning. One of the striking things about generative AI is its ability to simulate what really looks to be like human reasoning of all kinds. And so I think it raises a question about what is distinctive about the human person in a way and to a degree that other kinds of technology, including past forms of AI, did not. I think AI also raises another concern, which is not unique to it, but is arguably unique to modern technology. And here again, I think Laudato Si has interesting lessons to offer us. And that is that, as Gene mentioned, truly transformative technologies are not simply neutral tools. In a whole range of ways, even their core capabilities, I should say, are enabled through a remaking of the world in which they come to inhabit. A good example of this is the car. If we think about the most advanced automotive technology you can imagine, and you go back in time and you place that car into a pre-modern forest, it would be a useless form of technology. The full capability of the automobile is made possible through an entire physical, material, legal, normative infrastructure that was developed over the course of a century. In the course of doing that, in a certain way, the car remade society. We were sort of remade in the image of the automobile in some very real sense. And of course, at each moment in that transformation, there are a whole set of value judgments which could pull in different directions. And here, Gene and I may disagree about some of those value judgments. But I think it's very clear and important to see that truly transformative technologies are transformative in just this sense. And for this reason, they raise a set of distinctive ethical questions. And here I think the philosopher Hans Jonas offers some helpful insights that are congruent with the insights of Laudato Si. What Jonas saw was that modern technologies have the capacity, because of the power that they enable, have the capacity to reshape entire societies, even the entire globe. And for this reason, they raise ethical questions that don't have an obvious analog in pre-modern forms of technology. In a certain sense, this ethical question extends even to the sciences because, of course, modern sciences to some degree enable these forms of technological power. And so what Jonas said was that we needed to develop a distinctive ethic of responsibility. An ethic of responsibility that was sensitive to our obligations to distant others, those who are distant from us in space and in time. And I think here we can see a close analogy with AI. We don't have to fantasize about science fiction apocalyptic scenarios to see how the capacities that AI seems to enable could remake society on a fairly large scale for both better and worse. And for that reason, it raises a distinctive set of ethical questions. And here I come back to Laudato Si, which was ultimately concerned with what Pope Francis called the globalization of this technocratic paradigm, and what were ultimately our concerns for the common good. So what might it look like to think about a technology like AI in the context of the rival paradigm that Pope Francis was directing us to? I think it would be a paradigm in which technologies like AI, but not only AI, would be recognized as dignifying the human person insofar as what they afford us is an augmentation or a complementarity with our distinctive human capabilities, our capacity to know, our capacity to create and engage in moral reasoning. I think that there are cases in which AI and other kinds of modern technologies clearly can do this. At the same time, these dimensions of the human person provide us a standpoint from which we can recognize how certain technologies, AI included, can degrade the human person, whether by offloading certain distinctively human capabilities in ways that prevent us overtly or in more subtle ways from developing our full capabilities, from obscuring the goals towards which these technologies are optimizing, and precluding the kind of moral deliberation in which we could, only within which we can engage in the kind of ethic of responsibility that Hans Jonas outlined. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can get into some more specifics in the course of the conversation. Thank you.
Keep your love on. I want to take this microphone. Really nourishing stuff, and I know folks have a lot to say, so please be ready to do it. I want to mention here, we had two other people on this panel, and that would have been two people too many, because there's so much to chew on, but it's Bishop Paul Tai from the Vatican, who's one of the main authors of Antiqua et Nova, the kind of the tech, more than that, AI, digital culture, reflection. No, it's from a dicastery, so it's not an exhortation or a encyclical, but it's a Vatican document. It's very important. I steer you to it. And then we were going to have Christine Rosen, who has a great book called The Extinction of Experience. And Christine has, Paul had a family matter in Dublin, and Christine has jury duty in our nation's capital. So we miss them, but we are blessed by Gene and Tony. We do need Alistair McIntyre to provide connective tissue between Gene's strong Marxian vein and Tony's strong Aristotelian vein. He was the guy that could do that. But let's start here. I think there's something, so between virtue, Tony, and sacramentality, do you see a connection between those two really important, I would say, Catholic values? When we're entertaining the promise and peril of AI, Anything to say about those two things as they collide, how you think about that? It's a tough one.
I was going to try to wait for Tony to say something about that. Well, Tony mentioned that we need a different anthropology, and I completely agree with that. I think the anthropology that suffuses the technocratic paradigm and also, I think, suffuses the discipline of economics is one that we need to discard because I think it's a fraud. And in this regard, I will always quote my hero, John Ruskin, who at the beginning of Unto This Last called economics a soi-disant science, much like alchemy and tarot cards and astrology. Am I being offensive enough to
I think so.
economists?
Oh.
Okay. Okay. But I think that anthropology is part and parcel of a different kind of cosmology that I mentioned. Because cosmology is about the way you think about the world, right? What do you think the world is? And if you believe that the world is in some way a revelation of the divine, then you think of it in what used to be called theophanic terms, right? You think of the universe as a manifestation of divinity. And so I think in some ways that might be a link, at least, between a McIntyrean conception of virtue and the sort of sacramental cosmology that somebody like Gerard Manley Hopkins certainly epitomized.
Yeah, I would say two things that kind of go in different directions. And for the record, I don't usually feel defensive about economists or feel like I should play the role of defending technocrats. But I think one of the really interesting things about Laudato Si is I think it correctly recognizes that the conception of the cosmos, the idea that nature is not raw material, but it has a kind of intelligibility, that it is the ultimate kind of framework and horizon in which we engage in things like scientific reasoning, but that ultimately points beyond the human. It ultimately requires some notion of the transcendent. That conception really is the starting point for modern science in a way. And so there's a sense in which the false anthropology we're talking about is actually self-undermining even of the scientific project. And so I think that's maybe a link there. I think that there's a very distinct, we say it's a different anthropology. In some sense, it's an ancient anthropology. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that it's one that in some way I think is presupposed by the modern scientific enterprise in pretty clear ways, actually. And this is one of the reasons why I think, though I think there are ways in which modern AI can be helpful in the scientific enterprise, ultimately a lot of the claims that are made about its capabilities are fairly silly, because science is ultimately treated as just a kind of algorithm, as if scientific discovery takes place through algorithmic processes, which of course it doesn't. The other thing I was going to suggest, thinking about McIntyre and the link to virtue, is McIntyre's conception of practices, I think, are helpful here. So when I think about ways in which AI in particular, but not only that kind of technology, can be dignifying, as I suggested, but also degrading, I think about human practices. And we shouldn't just think about AI as this nebulous, free-floating technology, but it's a capability that can and is and will be in different ways integrated in different domains of human practice. And what's distinctive about human practices is that they have their own internal goals and norms. And so those can be very helpful for thinking about how these technologies can be used well and also used badly, or they can reshape human practices in ways that are degrading, because there's some normative standpoint from which we can say this is actually not helping us achieve the ends that we want.
Let me tee this up, and you can go, Gene, because I think you'll come right out of this. But so McIntyre also his view of the person is a rational, dependent animal, and that implies a community. And so, what is it about AI that disaggregates
and atomizes. And maybe you can, I know you're going somewhere with a thought. So what do you think, Gene?
Well, no, I was thinking while Tony was speaking about the account of the history of science as, that culminates in this technocratic paradigm. One subject I've been reading a lot about lately is capital R romantic science during the 19th century, exemplified in people like Alexander von Humboldt, Sir Humphrey Davy, and even to some extent Goethe, who were obviously respectful of modern Enlightenment science, but also wanted to somehow hold on to some kind of a notion of the transcendent or even the sacramental. And you read some of their scientific work today, and it would seem to us rather strange that they don't just talk about experiment, they don't just talk about the deductive or the inductive method, but they talk about nature as having spirit. And that would get you laughed out of a lab right today. But people like, especially Humboldt, who not only was a great scientist, but was also a best-selling writer. I think it was something like 5 or 6 volume study Cosmos, which, yes, gave Carl Sagan his title, right, in the 1980s and 90s. He's writing about nature is visible spirit, right? I think that's kind of, sort of, what Francis might have been alluding to when he's writing about an alternative.
You're a philosopher of science, Tony. Would the animation of nature get you laughed out of a lab, or how do you, or is Catholic scientist an oxymoron?
No, I think that, there's a sort of deeper, there is a deeper philosophical question lurking here, which is whether modern science really is just a method of manipulation and control. Is that really at its core? Is that what the modern scientific enterprise is? And I think that's the sort of Baconian idea. So Francis Bacon sort of innovates that conception, and it gets taken up and popularized by the French philosophers, and that's really where we get that idea from. It's often assumed that just is what modern science is, rather than seeing it as a contestable interpretation of science that was given by a very strange, eccentric Englishman with unsettling views about the monarchy. And I am of the view that it's a false picture of modern natural science. There is clearly an extent to which modern science enables vast amounts of technological power that's undeniable. You can see that with the discovery of atomic physics. And I think we could maybe say something similar about the sort of to the extent that modern AI rests on scientific discovery in that kind of way. We could say something similar about AI. But I think this is where I find Hans Jonas quite helpful in thinking about an ethic of responsibility. There are lots of kinds of knowledge that enable us to exert power in ways that can be used for ill. And I think what's helpful to me about Laudato Si is it's an effort to situate the scientific enterprise in a moral universe which is ultimately theological, right? Seeing science as having to have dialogue with sources of knowledge that recognize the transcendent more explicitly, even if it's sort of latent in the scientific enterprise. And there, I think, just on the history, I think there's one way that I think about this is that the real innovation with sort of what we could recognize as a scientific view of nature is differentiating nature from mythos, from the idea that it's just the raw material of the gods, and seeing it instead as having its own inbuilt intelligibility that we can somehow come to know. Not to master, but to know.
You almost have to unlearn that earlier mythos stuff before you can really embrace, isn't that? That's interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to point out one movement that's happening, and then we're going to open it up to the crowd, so get ready to go. One of Tony's colleague of ours, Megan Sullivan at Notre Dame, is really doing great work as a philosopher in helping the humanities in kind of a way of reason to enter into these, to run away AI. Because you know and I know, it's like a hockey stick, right? all of a sudden, things are going along, then boom, the graph goes up because AI is well out of the stable and institutions and people are not ready to react to it. So Megan is really doing great work, and she has something called the Delta kind of method. And the Delta is DELTA. So when we're dealing with AI and creeping AI and kind of the excarnation of our lives, Delta: dignity, embodiment, love, transcendence, and agency. That's what Delta stands for. That's what's needed in a response. What do you have to say, crowd? Katie has a mic, I have a mic, and we will.
Or not, lack of perception, 10 years on, and then more broadly, perhaps, globally. By way of context, 10 years ago, I was the intern running the social media for the USCCB for Laudato Si, which is ironic on a number of levels, in the summer of 2015. And I remember walking over to the Hill with the JPHD team that was launching it, Justice, Peace, and Human Development, and having we had a Senate hearing and a House hearing in Congress for the document. And there was maybe 7 senators there and a bunch of legislative directors and chiefs of staff. And I'll never forget 2 unnamed senators for the life of me. I will not say who, one from each major party, arguing behind me as I'm trying to tweet out like hashtag Laudato Si from the event. Even then, like just arguing over the meaning and really wrestling with this sort of like, to them perhaps, both in different ways, in context, impenetrable at the time document, this overwhelming document, this beautiful document that was sort of a cipher and very strange to that American political environment. So I guess, how do you see it affecting the American Catholic community's way of understanding itself, or not, at 10 years on?
Not.
Yeah.
And I'm not, in some ways, I think I know why, but in other ways, I'm not sure at all. Certainly, Laudato Si has, I think, at least in Catholic colleges and universities, is often taught. I mean, I know that at Villanova, numerous colleagues of mine and myself teach big bleeding chunks of it, or we teach it in its entirety. In certain courses. So it's not as though Laudato Si isn't getting a hearing in Catholic higher ed. So I would say, ask the guys in the pulpits why they're not talking about it. And my suspicion is that a lot of the guys in the pulpits don't like it because it sounds like, oh, this is liberal, green, schmucky, sort of stuff. And that's the way it was often characterized in the American media, right? Certainly by the renowned scholar Rush Limbaugh, who called Francis a straight-up Marxist. What are you going to do? The other thing that I would ask was what was the reception of, say, something like Rerum Novarum or Quadragesimo Anno and earlier social encyclicals as a sort of a point of comparison?
Yeah, I guess I don't know how to assess its influence, or I share the sense that it's also taught. So I guess I don't know that I would answer no. I'm not sure. We were probably at the same events, by the way, 10 years ago. So from that vantage point, I will say, from the standpoint of the kind of Catholic intellectual life in Washington, my experience was different, that there certainly was lots of media coverage, and I wrote about that media coverage at the time very critically, but that there was at least just sort of speaking personally, the circles that I swam in, which included lots of folks on the right of center, a lot of interest, and it was taken very seriously. Maybe disagreements over how it was being interpreted on the left, what its obvious policy implications might be. But the idea that it was an important document that should form our moral conscience as Catholics, I think, was at least widespread in the waters that I swim in. I do think it was difficult because, so there was a game that this feels like a century ago, but in like around that period of time, Pope Francis would say something, and the media would go crazy, and New York Times would praise him as a liberal, and the conservative media would decry him as a Marxist. And the game was, well, let's just look at what he said, and let's look at what his predecessor said. And it turns out this is just, if you know anything about Catholic social teaching, fairly conventional Catholic social teaching. And I think this encyclical, to a certain extent, fit that pattern. A lot of what was going on there is developing things that were actually fairly developed in Benedict's writings, and to some extent in JP2's writings as well. But I do think that entire strain of intellectual moral thought doesn't fit well into the American political scene. I think that's been true for a long time. I think it was true of Rerum Novarum. I think that may be part of the issue. I think the jury's still out. I imagine that Laudato Si will be drawn upon by the current Pope in his thinking about AI and related issues. I think we have yet to see how that will actually be developed further. But
one thought that just occurred to me about the possible difference between the reaction to Laudato Si and to, say, Quadragesimo Anno in the 1930s was that it seemed to me, as historians would put this, you had a much thicker Catholic culture in the 1930s and 40s. We were talking about this at dinner last night, how the community sort of structures of Catholicism, and not just the church, were much stronger. And so it was in the 30s, fairly quickly after the publication of Quadragesimo Anno, that you had Catholic labor unions, you had Catholic labor alliances who would actually talk about the encyclical. And whatever differences people may have had about the policy implications, you had a greater, wider popular consciousness of the encyclical and what it at least seemed to be saying. You just don't have that now.
Dissolution of some of the Catholic subculture.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. This is wonderful. I wanted to thank all the students for coming. We'd like to hear from you. Are there any student voices who want to jump in and say anything? Don't feel any pressure. Oh, thank you, Faith.
Yeah, thank you guys for your presentation. Earlier on, when Tony was giving his 15-minute sort of introduction, you mentioned how AI has a certain possibility of complementing human capacities. And I'm wondering if these complements to human capacities are enough to dismiss or justify the fear of its manipulative influence that Gene was sort of previously talking about in his presentation.
Yeah, so if you're to do a reckoning on its, yeah, I think it really depends on the way in which it's developed and deployed. I mean, I guess I would think about it in two ways. There's a question of sort of how the technology is developed, and maybe we can come back to that, because there I do think the question of the values that are implicit in it are important. But you can also think about it sort of as, to use an abhorrent expression, the end users of the technology, right? The way in which it's integrated into domains that, think about medicine, right? And I think there are lots of examples where it can be dignifying. And I think these tend to be contexts in which we have sort of established human practices with agreed upon identifiable goals and norms, right? So I think medicine's a good example. The medical profession is very well acquainted with grappling with advanced technologies and the integration of that into the clinical setting and other settings. Not always well, right? But there, I think we have a flourishing human practice. It's not perfect, but it has well-established norms, and I sort of worry less in those sorts of domains, right? I think where, another example, I think a lot of the kind of anxiety or enthusiasm about AI trades on what context we're talking about, right? So the way in which AI interfaces with social media, can generate lots of anxiety for very good reason. And then you think about an example like AlphaFold, which was a sort of bespoke quasi-generative AI technology that was developed to solve a discrete scientific problem, which is protein folding. This is a very computational heavy field, and it required lots of work. It was very difficult. It's not the most exciting form of scientific research. And AlphaFold, almost overnight, just radically transformed that field by very efficiently and effectively identifying protein structures. That has lots of implications of all kinds, and some of them may pose ethical risks and so on and so forth. But you take a case like that, I think is very different than a case like AI as romantic partners. Right? I don't really know how you compare those. Right? I don't really know what scale we would weigh these things on to know if it's one benefit's worth this cost. I don't think that's the right framework for thinking about it ultimately. But that's why I think it's helpful to think in terms of the context. But I think that there is a larger question around the development of the technology itself. And here I do think it's worth recognizing that many, I don't think all, but many folks in Silicon Valley do have their own kind of secular eschatology and religion, right? And this sort of gets to that component of the technocratic paradigm that I was referencing, the sort of progressivist vision of history as improving through the application of scientific technique. The kind of absurd culmination of that is transhumanism. Yeah. And that is a prevalent view. I don't want to exaggerate its prevalence. I don't think everybody that works in the AI field is a transhumanist, but some of them really are and have quite strange views. And so I think we need to be open and honest about that.
But that was like Whiggish utopianism and altruism in the early days. It's morphed into something kind of more nefarious, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's still prevalent, and I think it's. But my point is that it's worth subjecting that to critical scrutiny, right? Because it is a false anthropology, and it should matter if the people who are developing technologies have an incorrect vision of the human person.
Let me drill down a little bit. Drill down. Did I say that? Corporate speak. I'm going to sunset that word. Drill down. I'm going to
Double click.
Yeah. I'm going to blue sky. I'm going to blue sky new terms.
I'm out. I'm out.
Okay. AI. How maybe students. We all use it. Has anybody heard of ChatGPT by chance? Professors have strong feelings on it, but I learned one little fact that kind of connects these two worlds. When you do a 120-word query on a ChatGPT, it costs you 16 ounces of water to cool down the batteries and the energy. One observation. Anybody over here have a question or a comment or pushback or insight? Yep.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for your talks tonight. I'm a little stuck on one of the aspects of integral development about this encyclical, and it's the poor. And where do they come in? The development was supposed to be good for creation and the poor together. And so how are you thinking about this in terms of labor? And also, I think it's probably connected to, would you conceive of AI as a rupture? I can't help but think of the cognitive de-skilling aspect of this. And what happens, I mean, in Antiqua et Nova, the idea of humans having the capacity to grasp the truth seems to be a phrase that recurs a lot. And I'm not seeing that with the use of AI. You know, people are sending emails that they didn't write and then replying on emails that they haven't read, essentially. So there's a couple of issues embedded in there, but I think you get my drift. Thanks.
Yeah, in some ways, I don't think it is a rupture because, as I said, I think we need to start thinking about the development of AI in continuity with other forms of automation, right? We're talking about it as though it's this new thing that's somehow unprecedented. No, it's got precedence all the way back to the 18th century, right? So when we think about the de-skilling of artisanal communities, right? Artisanship is a mental as well as a manual form of labor. And so therefore, when mechanization comes along and wipes out whole categories of artisanal skill, that's a form of cognitive de-skilling right there. Not just, you're no longer not working with your hands, you're not working with your head either. So once again, I think we need to stress the continuities in these technologies and not simply the ways in which they're unique. As far as the first part of your question, which I think was about how we should think about labor
Yes.
in terms,
especially globally and in less developed nations?
Yeah, I don't have a copy of Laudato Si with me. You would think that I would have brought one.
I've got mine.
Okay, I mean, I don't remember which paragraph this is, but Francis does in fact address this in several parts of the encyclical. And one thing that he does, well, two things. One thing that he does say about automation is that we should be very circumspect about it, precisely because of the fact that when you are automating, you are de-skilling. You are taking a human skill and you are relocating it in a machine. You are literally dehumanizing the act of production, right? We use that word a lot, dehumanization, but I don't really think we really think hard enough about what that means. And so when you are dehumanizing something, you are taking people out of it. Now, that one of the questions it would seem to me that we should be asking ourselves is, do you want to do that? Maybe in a lot of areas of life you do. There's a lot of unnecessary, tedious mental labor that can be taken care of by a calculator. Great, wonderful. I'm not so sure about, for example, dating apps. Right? Really? Do you really want your romantic life governed by algorithms? Oh, is he a 90% match or a 95% match?
Or do you want your romantic partner to be an algorithm?
Or even, yeah, right. Do you want that? So that's number one. But number two, and I touched on this a little bit in my remarks, but Francis is very, very skeptical about whether, of course, this automated technology is really going to help the poor. And as I alluded to in my remarks, we tend to think that somehow this technology is ethereal, when in fact it is very material in terms of the resources it eats up, the resources it needs, and the human labor involved, usually in Africa, South America, and in Asia. And the sort of labor that these people have to do, sitting in front of laptop computers, curating images, many of which are pornographic and sadistic. And there's a great book, if you're interested in this, Phil Jones, Work Without the Workers, who documents the very real psychological damage that's done by looking at millions of these images, day in and day out.
Let's see. I'll pass to somebody else, but thank you.
Someone over there?
Thank you both for a very rich discussion. And Gene, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how, as you said, the discipline of economics has maybe built up this technocratic paradigm, and if you think there might be a use for economics or something like it in the sort of alternative models that we've been talking about, and Tony, you can also jump into if you have any.
So one of the first things I say to freshmen, and believe it or not, I have a lot of business students who actually enroll in my courses, who I will say to them, the first couple of days that you're in freshman economics, you're not in economics class. You're in a philosophy class because you were taught two things. You were taught, A, that the world is a place of scarcity, and two, that the model of the human being is a rational, utility-maximizing individual. First of all, the first one is an ontological account. That is called ontology. You were making a claim about the nature of the world, on which the whole rest of the discipline is founded, right? If that's not true, everything collapses, all right? The second, a rational utility-maximizing individual. Has anyone here ever met a rational utility-maximizing individual? Oh, yes, you have. That person is called a sociopath, right? So right there, it seems to me that the foundational assumptions, ontological and anthropological of the discipline, are false. They are not just unedifying; they are false. And so it seems to me that any new kind of economics would have to start from different ontological and anthropological assumptions, right? And it seems to me that those assumptions in the current forms of at least mainstream economics simply reinforce this technocratic paradigm. I guess the second response I'd have is that any new kind of economics, to me, should look more like what used to be called political economy. Because what the term economics gives you is a sense that, well, it's this economic life has its own kind of rules, it has its own sort of principles. It's somehow totally separate from politics. Give me a break. That's why it seems to me political economy, which was a discipline, this was what it was called until the 19th century. Political economy is just truth in advertising, right? Politics and economics are always bound up together. And so I would rather think about it in a more Aristotelian vein. Go back to, I mean, certainly don't go back literally to Aristotle and, and the oikos. But thinking about the oikos as how it's connected to the polis. That would seem to me at least a good start.
Remember, oikos is more than yogurt. It's the Greek word for home, right?
Yeah. We probably don't want all aspects of the Aristotelian oikos.
No. Yes,
I might add, I think that there are intellectual resources within economics that I think can offer a kind of counter to this picture, which, I'm not going to sit here and sort of try to give my account of what mainstream economics looks like. But to the extent that it looks like what Gene says it does, it's clearly a false picture. But it's notable. I mean, it's not just traditions on the left. If you look at sort of thinkers we associate with the center right, Michael Polanyi, Friedrich Hayek, their conception of the economy is actually doesn't bear any resemblance to what Gene was just describing. The idea of the economy as a machine with inputs and outputs that we can manipulate. The critique of central planning that those guys made 100 years ago was rooted in a rejection of that picture of the economy and society and a rejection of technocracy. So I think that there is a kind of richer intellectual set of traditions within economics that don't necessarily pull in one political direction, actually, that we could draw on for thinking about that. But that's maybe a different conversation.
It's good. We're getting down. I don't have my watch on, but I know we have about 10 minutes left. I want to read some from the live stream. A couple from some, I guess, big hitters. Our friend Graham Ward is writing from Oxford, great scholar. Graham writes, "Technology is merely a mechanism by which humans deliver their priorities. Is the promise in peril not that of humanity itself?" Just think about that. Then David O'Brien. David O'Brien, who's a great kind of Catholic intellectual tradition, just a legendary guy whom I owe an email. He calls himself an honorary alum of Loyola too. I love that, David. "I am interested," says David, in how in responding to AI we do better than we did with nuclear power. On the letter, we then we called Free World started off well, but in the long haul, not so well. Maybe one for you you can respond to those if you want to, but here's just one that's kind of right down the middle. How is AI affecting, this is from Leo Arnold, how is AI affecting the human brain and relationships? How is it changing communities and societies?
Can I say something about the first
Fall to your bliss, Tony.
question? The nuclear question is interesting too, but I don't remember the exact language, but the idea of technology being about our priorities.
Yeah.
This is connected to something that I was going to say earlier in response to a question. I do think, I agree with Gene that in many respects AI is continuous with past technological developments and social developments, for better and worse. That can pull in different directions. But I think often when we are talking about where AI poses concerns, we are talking about domains of social life that are already quite broken. And so I often find that it's focus on the technology is almost distracting. domains of human practice that have already become emaciated for all kinds of reasons that don't have much to do with AI. Those tend to be the places where it's very tempting to use AI because our standards for what excellence looks like have been degraded to such an extent that why not? We have a problem with social isolation, predates generative AI by quite a long time. And so I do think it's always worth raising that question, like to what extent are these technologies amplifying or trading on problems that pre-exist them? And for the I don't want to say that's always true, but I think often, maybe most of the time, that is true.
Yeah, I just want to riff off of that because a really good book that I read recently is entitled The Last Human Job.
Oh, yeah, I have that.
By, I think her name is Allison Phillips. She's Johns Hopkins. So what she does in this book is she looks at how automation is being introduced into things like psychological services, therapy, counseling, even clergy are now being required to use it, which, God, I don't know what that would mean. But it's precisely in these areas of life that, as Tony said, are broken. And so the terrible irony here is that many more people now who go into therapy or counseling or whatever are being themselves, or the therapists and counselors are being subjected to metrics, whether it's from the private or the public sector. Their work is now increasingly being judged by the number of patients they see every day, by it's simply a matter of metrics, which are determined in many ways by algorithms, and so their labor is in many ways being automated. And I mean, hence the title, The Last Human Job.
Can I add something here? This is using medicine as an example in a very different way than I did earlier. I was talking to a physician friend who's interested in AI, and I made the point that one of the interesting challenges of using AI technologies in clinical contexts is that it's automating processes that encode value judgments, right, in very, very real and technical ways. So like one of the big issues in medicine are type 1 and type 2 errors. You have false positives and false negatives in testing, for example. It says it detects something that's not there or it misses something that's there, right? And there is a value judgment question about what threshold you set that detection level at. This is a well-known issue in medicine and other areas that rely on detection technology. If you can automate that, maybe you can make that better in some ways. It's an open question technically, but you're sort of black boxing the decision there because it's going to be in some really efficient technology that you're relying on. And so I made the point that this is sort of an interesting question and a problem, and my physician friend said, well, so my suggestion was, well, this could be an opportunity because doctors maybe it would force them to reflect on these kinds of value judgments and think about how they use technologies well and so on. And he said, well, doctors don't do that anyway. Right? And so I think it's a very clear example, like, well, maybe they ought to be. Maybe clinical reasoning should be involving reflection on those value questions more explicitly. The technology might, in some ways, optimize certain processes. It might make those value judgments more opaque. But the problem is ancillary, so it predates the technology.
This is making me think of something that the theologian Stanley Hauerwas once said about medical ethics. As soon as you have medical ethics, you know you have a problem. Right. Because it's a sign that the very practice of medicine is broken.
That's gold right there. Maybe two quick ones to wrap the evening. Stanley, did he also use any profanity when he said that?
I did not.
Last thoughts, comments? Doesn't have to be anything. Just it could be a comment without any, just an observation. Yeah. Okay.
This might be my worst nightmare, coming back to my alma mater and defending banks and tech companies at a philosophy event. So, have you ever thought about the pursuit of AI and these technologies for tech companies and finance companies as actually like an introspective reflection of itself? I think some themes have been touched upon. I like the one about I'm writing the email, I didn't read it, nor did I write it. People already hate that they're writing emails. I think one of the big reasons these companies are going after it is actually all their experience is in corporate America of sitting in Excel files, doing 100,000 rows of files. sitting or being told by companies they have to do 10 years of jobs, which kind of degrade their brains. They just sit there doing processes and not learning the actual business. They're kind of actually possibly investing in these things to, I guess, lay the path forward for the next generation of people in these practices to learn what the business is actually about. I think they've seen throughout their time there some actual very microeconomic in their workplace income inequality, where there's only a few people who can break out of that shell of looking at PowerPoints and Excel and get to the next best job. I think that's a lot of the perspective they're coming, is they're actually reflecting on the workforce they lived in, they were taught to do, and say, how can we make that better? It's not necessarily them just looking at society, but looking within the organizations they're in and all the people they've ever interacted with.
I'm happy to say something about that. So I think it's a point well taken. I think it's important. I would say two things. I think it's important to differentiate the companies that are building these technologies and what they say they are for and are capable of doing, and how the technologies are being actually absorbed into traditional firms. And what you see there is that uptake of AI is actually quite slow. It's not nearly as, it doesn't map onto the sort of rhetoric and a lot of the media accounts. And where you do see it are in areas, so-called non-strategic uses in firms. So if you think about the things that companies all have to do, PowerPoints, various kinds of clerical work, those are the domains in which AI is having a lot of uptake. In aspects of firms where strategic decisions are being made, profit and loss is at issue, where your competitive advantage is at stake, AI is not being used. And that doesn't actually seem very surprising. But I think that can cut both ways, because something that is happening as a result of that is that a lot of jobs that are entry-level jobs for actually quite, someone asked earlier about the poor. What's interesting about this wave of technology development is that what's different about it is that it's impacting domains that are relatively, upscale on the labor market, right? So these are white collar type skills, not at the C-suite level, right? But at the level of clerical work and that sort of thing. But also coding, right? So lots of people who are graduating with computer science degrees, including even master's level degrees, are not able to find work because the conventional entry-level positions have basically been automated away. Now you might look at that and say, well, maybe that's exactly the kind of thing we would want to automate, and maybe these well-educated people can go do something more interesting. The flip side is that those are entry-level positions, and there are ways that traditionally those companies have hired and mentored young people to become, to grow and develop other skills and to be socialized into to those firms. And so I think it does raise an interesting kind of ethical question about automation. Gene was mentioning earlier.
I do think that's an interesting point. I do agree. I was remarking with friends how ironic it was 10 years ago, the learn to code movement of all these white-collar people telling blue-collar people to lose their jobs, and we're quite in the opposite direction right now. I will say the entry-level position comment is kind of interesting, because what these companies end up normally doing is actually laying off middle-aged people because they're expensive for labor. And as somebody who works at a Fortune 500 company, the entry-level positions are not the ones that are going to be cut because we're cheap labor. We're actually getting developed a little bit more. It's actually a weird economic advantage we're getting in that practice.
Yeah, I think it probably depends. I think I was thinking there about coding.
In coding, it's a little bit different, but if you...
But for general, yes, for the clerical stuff, exactly,
We're at time. We're at time. Gene, you get the last word, then we'll wrap it. So, Gene.
I think we should be asking whether a lot of what corporate America does either should or needs to be done. I keep thinking, when I think about work, I really do think that in some ways this book should be required reading. Bullshit Jobs by David Graeber. The title says it all. Because I think one of the great things about that book and Graeber's work in general is that he's forcing us to ask ourselves these questions. What do we really need to do? Is a lot of the stuff that we do totally unnecessary? Is it really even good for us? And I think that's an even more fundamental question. Should we be doing the things we're doing?
On behalf of the Hank family who who are so generous, we're so grateful to the Hank family. On behalf of Bernard Prusak and Sister Catherine, on behalf of Tony and Gene, Hank staff, thank you for being at Loyola. God bless you all, and we'll see you again. Thank you.